Bonsoir, mon nom c'est Roch Comeau de la compagnie Roche Research et permettez-moi de continuer en anglais. I'm an English engineer. Tonight we've been hearing about some interesting mobility and navigation topics, from automobiles to human beings walking around to drones. I think we can safely call those macroscopic navigation applications. But I think the title of tonight also promised from macroscopic to molecular, so I think I'm going to be as close to molecular as it gets tonight, so we'll see. I can't resist plugging the company a little bit. We're a small biotech company in Montreal, just up the street on Saint Laurent Street, about 20 employees. So we manufacture primarily neuronavigation, brain stimulation, and brain imaging equipment for the neuroscience world. So we have hundreds of labs around the world using our equipment, and we've been around for a little over 15 years. So just to describe navigation, so instead of talking about neuronavigation right away, I'm going to use an analogy that everyone understands, and that's GPS. Right? So every navigation system under the hood, really all it's trying to do is convert coordinates from the real world to coordinates that we can use on a computer to display where we are. For example, in a GPS, which everyone I think has some experience with, on the Earth, satellites can calculate our position anywhere on the planet in latitude and longitude coordinates. So that's one coordinate system. Except we want to display a representation of ourselves on a map, and the map is on a computer. And the computer doesn't think of latitude and longitude, it thinks in pixels. So we need a mathematical way to convert between latitude and longitude to pixels on the screen. And once the computer can do that calculation, it can display a representation of ourselves on the map. So one simple way to do that is to identify some points on the map where we know what they are in pixels because we're clicking on the map. But if we happen to know the latitude and longitude coordinates, the computer can use that to calculate what's called the transformation. So once it has that, it's a matrix essentially, to go from the real world to the image world, the computer can then display a representation of yourself, but also figure out how to get you from where you are to where you want to be. So navigation is actually, or neuronavigation, when you're talking about navigating the brain, is not new. In fact, it was developed in the early 20th century, not long after X-rays were invented. The idea is that you can see an image of an X-ray on the wall, but a physician or a neurosurgeon wants to be able to get a tool to a particular location in the brain based on those images. So in the early 20th century, Horsley and Clark, two neuroscientists, invented something called a stereotactic frame. Sorry, I don't have a laser pointer, so I can't really point to these, but if you think of that, you can see this little cube on the screen. The cube defines a three-dimensional coordinate space. So instead of latitude, longitude, there's an XYZ coordinate system. And you can attach tools to the stereotactic frame. And you can dial up essentially the XYZ location on the frame and guide that tool to the correct location. Now the navigation system, what it does is it marries the imaging to this physical tool, much like a GPS would marry the real world to the image space. So on that frame, you can attach things, markers, that would show up on the X-ray images, if it's a two-dimensional X-ray, or more recently, three-dimensional markers that can be seen on CT scans or MRI scans. And that allows you to calculate then a transformation from the 3D image coordinate to the 3D stereotactic frame coordinate. So a neurosurgeon can then pick a spot in the brain and know how to guide that tool to the correct location, or perhaps more importantly, avoid structures that you want to avoid. Now, that's an old tool. It's still actually used in some applications today, but more recently, we've developed more modern tools called image-guided neurosurgery, which is another way of saying neuronavigation. So the stereotactic frame itself has been replaced by a three-dimensional position sensor, kind of a high-resolution version of the Kinect that you might have seen in other applications. The idea is that you can then co-register the real space, which is the patient's head, to MRI images of the subject. So when you combine that with modern computer graphics, you can display much more elaborate images of the brain, which allows the surgeon to use much more information to figure out where they want to go, how they want to get there. So using tools like this today, there are many operations that a surgeon 20 years ago would have considered impossible to do. So with these modern tools now, we can be more aggressive at treating patients. Now, I'm more into the neuroscience world than the neurosurgery world, so a common application that we use in neuroscience is brain stimulation or brain mapping. So for me, the 3D world that we're interested in, and the real world, is the subject's head, which is usually not a patient but a healthy volunteer. And the tool that we want to navigate is a brain stimulator. So on the screen you can see this little pallet that's sitting on my head that's called a magnetic brain stimulator, or transcranial magnetic stimulator. It's a way of non-invasively delivering electrical currents into the brain. So adding now the position sensor, so it's a similar model that you saw in the neurosurgical application and the computer software. So the position sensor allows us to track tools in the real world, right? So not around the world, but in a space of about a meter around your subject's head. So the sensor can calculate the position and orientation of the subject's head, the magnetic stimulator, and a pointing device that you can just move around the head. So instead of a map, you can think of the structural MR images of your subject as being the Google map. So just like calibrating the Google map by identifying some points in both of these reference frames, we can identify points on the computer images of my skin, so the bridge of my nose, tip of my nose, and some spots on the ear. And then we can use a track pointer to touch those same locations. That allows the computer to calibrate the system much like a GPS is calibrated. So here's an example. This is a video. Hopefully it'll work. So we can actually move now the brain stimulator on the head, and the computer can show you where you are. Now, if you know anything about anatomy, you might see this strip of brain that we're sort of circumnavigating with the stimulator. That's called the motor cortex. So different areas of that strip of brain will control different parts of your body, from the hand to your shoulder, to your trunk, to your leg, down to your foot. Now, that's only half of navigation. So we know where we are, but where do we actually want to go? So instead of looking at someone's head and just freehanding it, you can identify a target in the brain. So any target that you want that's based on your research. So you might have identified a location on the brain, and you want to use the stimulator to stimulate that part of the brain and see the reaction. So you might have a hypothesis that that part of the brain is important in a particular task. So if you can stimulate that part of the brain while they're performing the task, and you interrupt their ability to perform the task, you can then confirm that that part of the brain was important. And that's really the secret of brain mapping. So here, we know where we are. We also know where we want to be, so we can simply follow this little bullseye display to get us over the correct target. Now, just like in Google Maps, we can also display other information from the outside world. So while we were navigating the brain and stimulating, we could be using electrodes on the skin to measure what's called the evoked motor response, so the EMG. And since we know where the coil was, or what part of the brain we were stimulating, we can color code the brain with the response from those sensors. And that's another way of brain mapping. So if you look at that image, the hot spot in the middle of the brain is the spot that was most responsible for me operating my finger. We can do more sophisticated brain mapping. So here's a near-infrared imaging system. And again, we can use a navigation system to record the location of all the sensors on your head, so we can associate all the data you acquire from those sensors with what part of the brain you are imaging. So there's other navigation. So we can do other types of MRI imaging. So this is a structural diffusion imaging. So instead of just looking at the brain structure, we're looking at the brain connectivity. So all this kind of rich imaging information can be brought into the navigation system, and you can combine all this to provide a very comprehensive display to make your research decisions or make your analysis a lot simpler. So just the last little bit. So that's all passive navigation. But much like Google now, they're going beyond Google Maps and going to Google Cars, where the car is being controlled by the navigation system. We can connect the navigation system to a robot to perform automated brain mapping. So here's a robotic system from a company in France called Axelum Robotics. And our navigation system is controlling the position of that robot. And we can place the coil now very, very precisely over exact locations of the brain to do the stimulation. And because we're tracking the head, if the subject moves, the robot can compensate for the head motion and basically follow your head and stimulate. So we can do now more automated, more consistent procedures using the robotic TMS system. We can also extend that to the animal world. So in neuroscience, a lot of work is done with animals. So we are now developing a microsurgical robot to do very precise robotic surgery for more neuroscience applications. And the idea is, again, to increase the accuracy and the success of that type of research. And that's my talk. Thank you.